Now you probably want to use JavaScript to animate your pages or add some sort of interactive content or to get things to change, like my traffic light's doing here. But actually, you can use a lot of the features of HTML and CSS to create some of the effects, particularly with movement, to get things to fade in, to fade out, to slide into position without actually having to code that yourself. So in this video, we're just going to have a quick look at transitions and transformations. So again, if you're new to CSS, they might sound quite similar. A transition is effectively the amount of time it takes for a change to occur on the page. So for example, this page is a traffic light, and you can see that it's changing from red and amber, green, etc. But if you look very carefully, it's not changing instantly when the lights change. So I wanted to create the effect that you get with a real bulb, where it kind of glows gradually as the filament fills up and then kind of fades out. So it takes a fraction of a second for the bulb to come on and to disappear. So that's an example of a transition. There's also a thing called a transformation. So transformations can be as simple as rotating stuff. It's something that you can do to an element on a page. So if you want a paragraph to be at a jaunty angle, you can transform. You can rotate a paragraph. This is a dice that I made. I didn't make it for this particular with this technique in mind. It was about the spots, but actually, if we just have a look at this, so if I click the dice, it both rotates so that you can't see the spots just appearing and disappearing. It uses JavaScript to change the color, so the spots are just circular divs, as we looked at in the last video. But it doesn't rotate it instantly, so it takes an amount of time to rotate it. So this uses both a transformation and a division. So that's rotation in 3 dimensions. If you've seen this on my website, or you've seen the video of it on the YouTube channel, it's a kind of card trick that aims to demonstrate the purpose of parity. So the white and black represent the zeros and ones. But what it uses a 3D transformation. So it rotates the rectangle. So these are rectangular divs just rounded off at the corners, and they are rotated about the x-axis in 3 dimensions. So that gives that kind of flipping effect. And also, so that you can see it happen, again, it has a transition, so it takes an amount of time to do that. What it's also doing is it's also changing the color, because the idea was the cards were black on one side and white on the other, but you can't make divs different colors on both sides, so it actually it changes the color as it's flipping it. And you can apply transitions and transformations. So transformations are quite often used for rotation, for example, but you can also use it for transforming pictures. So the menu on my website, for example, the pictures are all color, and the highlighted and non-highlighted versions are the same image. They just use a filter. So they just there's a desaturation filter. So the filter is turned on to begin with, and when you move the mouse pointer over, the filter is turned off, so that the color reappears effectively. And this page here, my connections wall, does a similar thing. So some of the tiles have pictures in them. So when you select them, so if I select all the things that, so that's an OR, isn't it? So if I select all the things that are OR, so that one, notice what happens is the background and the foreground color of the div change. But if I do that, I'm not going to be able to see that diagram, that symbol on the dark background. So when I select that, as well as changing the background color, it applies a transformation to the image. So image, you can desaturate them, but you can also do things like invert the colors. So I apply a filter to any image within the div just to invert the colors. Because they're all black and white, that just switches them from black to white. So let's have a look at how we go about doing that in the web page. So I've started a page here already. So what we've got is a div which I've made circular, and I've put a button on there. We'll come back to that. We're not going to go too much into the depth of JavaScript today, but just so you can see, I'm going to illustrate a particular point. So I've styled the body, the page to be background of pale blue, and I've changed the font to Arial. Example is just the div, which is the red circle. So it's got a height and a width. I've made the background color red, Colour is the foreground colour, so that's the colour of the text. I've set the font size, and I've used a flex box so I can easily position the text. I can center it vertically. The next two items are just how do you center stuff in a flex box. I've given it a width and a height. I've rounded it off. I've given it some margin. When you've got two margins like that, the first one is top and bottom, the second one is left and right. So I've brought it down from the top a little bit, and I've centered it on the page, and I've rounded it off. So one of the things you can do is you can get things to animate when you hover. So there's a selector type called hover. So if we actually have a look at this page in the browser, it's here. So what that means is hover is what happens when you move the mouse pointer over it. Now, as I said in the first video, this won't happen with a touchscreen, but if you've got a mouse pointer, that happens. So hover is a separate set of styles that replace the original ones when you move the mouse pointer over the element. So that's what that does. So hover, all I've done is I've switched the backgrounds and the foreground colours. So you only need to indicate what's changed. You don't need to set all of the properties again. So example had a whole load of CSS properties going over there, but actually the only two things that change when I move the mouse pointer over it are those two. So those are the only things I include in the hover bit. And there's a paragraph that contains the button. So basically all I've done there is just center the button on the page to make it look a bit nicer. So if I want to transform stuff, there's a transform CSS property. So if I say when I hover over this, I want to, again, these are sorts of things you can look up. So transform, there's one called rotate. There's one called filter, which is what you use for the desaturating the pictures. So rotate, and there's a variety of units. I'm going to go for just rotate it 90 degrees. So, and I've missed out the S. So they go transform, rotate 90 degrees. So when I move the mouse pointer over it, as well as swapping the background and foreground colours, it's going to rotate it 90 degrees. So let's have a look at that. So obviously need to refresh my page. Okay. So that's doing the trick, but it's a bit jarring, isn't it? Because it happens suddenly. So that's a transformation. I'm rotating it. If I wanted to get that to kind of rotate into position, I don't need to code that. I don't need to, go through 90 steps and rotate it a degree at a time. What I can do is I can go back to here, and I could say, in my original example, so I'll say transform. No, sorry, transition. So that's how. So it's a bit like animations in PowerPoint. So you say you want this to appear, and then you choose how long it's going to take to appear. So again, I've missed the S out for some reason. So it takes three properties. First of all, what you want this to apply to, but there is one called all. How long do you want it to take? And again, there's a variety of units, but I'm just going to use 1s for 1 second. And then the effect. So I'm going to use ease. So there's a variety of different effects. Again, you can look these up. It's to do with the kind of acceleration. So ease means it starts off slowly, speeds up, and then it slows down. So it looks like it's kind of moving more naturally, really, because accelerating and then decelerating again. There is one called linear, which just moves the constant speed. So you might, depending on what sort of effect you're after and whether you're trying to replicate a real thing, you might want to look into that a little bit more detail. So now, if I save that page and I go back, refresh, it'll do the same thing. When I move the mouse pointer over it, it'll swap the the back and front colours, and it'll rotate it, but it'll take a second to do it. And you can select any time period you like. So if you wanted to make a clock, you could say, well, get an hour to do it. So that's that kind of idea. As I said, I mentioned in the previous video, there's a thing called Css Keyframes, which is an example of this. It's a kind of positioning, tweening kind of thing. So if you want to do a full-on animation and get things to move around, that might be something to look into. Okay, so and the reason that happens is because I've said all. on here. So you can choose. So if I want the color to change suddenly, but the thing to rotate over the period of a second, I can just put transform in there. So the only thing that happens gradually is transform. So now if I look at that, what will happen is if I refresh that, the colors will change suddenly, but the rotation will take a second. So you might want to, you know, control things separately like that. If you want to, you can just put a comma. So if you want one thing to take a second and something else to take 2 seconds, you can put a comma and then a second set of those things. So I'm just going to put that back to all. So that's hover, but obviously you're probably watching this playlist because you're interested in controlling stuff using JavaScript. So what I've done is I've added a button here. So this is the kind of basic principle of how these things work. And so this button, so it's an HTML item. The type, so it's input for some reason. Type is button. The value is what it says on the button. So it says click me. And then there's a property called onClick, which is what it does. Now you can just put the JavaScript straight in there, but what I've done is I've put the name of a function in there, so a function called spin, and then here in my script section, and we'll go through this in the later video, I've created a function called spin, and this is what it does. It finds the element using its ID, so it finds the element example, which is the div, and then it uses it changes the style transform property. So style is the stuff in the style section, transform is transform. And what I've done is I've set it to be 360. So again, if I just remove that and we go back and refresh that page, if I refresh this, it'll look like it's not doing anything. But it actually is rotating that thing 360, but because it happens so quickly, you don't see it happen. So if I just go back and put that back in, the transition property, what you'll see is these transitions also apply to things that you do in JavaScript. So now when I click the button, it'll take a second to rotate that. So that's quite handy. That'll save you a lot of work in your coding, getting the browser to do the animation for you, and it also means it'll work probably better on low-powered machines and mobile devices, etc. So that's the kind of basic principle of it. We'll look at how to combine this idea with JavaScript. So we'll get into JavaScript probably in the next video. But I'll just say one more thing that it's kind of sounds obvious, but it's something that can catch you out when you're a beginner to this idea, is that you can only animate using transition things that have a range of values. So bear in mind, so if I just refresh this, currently when I click the button, it takes a second to rotate that. So if I do something different, so if I say, instead of changing the transform property, I change visibility to hidden. So visibility hidden. So there's all sorts of properties in CSS you might want to look up. So because I've said all things should be done over the space of a second, you might expect what that would do is it would fade it out because it becomes hidden over the space of a second. So let's have a look, see if it does that. So I'm going to refresh that page. I'm going to click the button, and it looks like it doesn't do anything to begin with. So it is taking a second. So click, goodbye, but it's not fading out. And the reason for that is that visibility only has two states. It's either visible or it's not, and you can't fade between them. So you can only apply the transition to things that have a range of possible values. So that doesn't mean you can't fade stuff in and out, it just means you can't use the visibility property. There's a similar property called opacity, which determines how kind of transparent something is, and that has a value from 0 to 1, and you can make things semi-transparent, so that does have a range of values. So if I say opacity is 0, refresh that. When I click that, that does fade out. So if you want to animate things, you need to pick properties to change that do have a range of values. You know, pick something that's got an in-between value. There's no in-between visible and hidden, but there is a range of values of opacity. So you can say opacity 0.5, for example. So that's a quick look at transformations and transitions and how you can take advantage of them to do a lot of the animation work for you rather than having to kind of code it explicitly.